"You're bleeding." Thea didn't look up. She pressed the folded cloth harder against her palm and kept walking toward the truck. "I said you're bleeding," the man repeated. His voice had the texture of gravel dragged across frozen ground. "I heard you the first time." He didn't say anything else. He just watched her climb into the passenger seat, her hand wrapped in a piece torn from her apron, her jaw set at an angle that dared him to comment further. His name was Fletcher Dowd. She had married him 4 hours ago in the back office of a courthouse in Rivière-du-Loup, Quebec, in front of a clerk who smelled of instant coffee and hadn't bothered to look up from his paperwork. Thea Garnier was 24 years old, and she had just run out of options. Her mother had died in February. The cancer had moved fast, faster than the bills, which was saying something. The apartment lease expired March 1st. The diner where Thea worked cut her hours after she missed too many shifts during the final weeks of hospice. By April, she owed 3 months of debt to a landlord who had started calling twice daily, and a hospital system that sent letters in serious formal fonts that felt like a quiet kind of threat. Fletcher had come into the diner on a Tuesday. He ordered black coffee and a slice of whatever pie was left. He ate without looking at his phone. He left a 20 for a $6 meal and said nothing when he stood to leave, except to ask the owner quietly if there was a woman in town who needed steady work and wasn't afraid of cold weather. The owner had looked at Thea. Thea had looked at the $20 bill still sitting on the counter. 2 weeks later, she had signed a marriage certificate, packed 1 duffel bag, and climbed into a truck that smelled of diesel and pine resin beside a man she had spoken to a total of perhaps 30 sentences. This was survival. She was clear on that. She wasn't confused about what she was doing or why. The truck pulled north out of town, and the highway narrowed within the first hour, the low storefronts and gas stations dissolving into corridor of black spruce, so dense the road felt like a tunnel. Thea watched the trees and kept her bandaged hand in her lap. She had cut it on the edge of a broken picture frame while packing. The last photo of her mother, which she had wrapped carefully in a sweater and placed at the very bottom of her bag. Fletcher drove the way he spoke. No unnecessary movements. He didn't fidget with the radio, didn't drum his fingers, didn't glance at her to check if she was comfortable or frightened or both. He drove like a man who had driven this road so many times it no longer required thought. "How far?" Thea asked. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. 8 hours to the turnoff, 3 more after that. She did the arithmetic in her head. 11 hours. It was already past noon. "There's no town after the turnoff. There's a supply depot at Sainte Marguerite. That's the last one." She absorbed this, the last town. The phrase landed somewhere quiet and cold in her chest, but she didn't let it move on her face. They stopped once at a gas station north of Quebec City, where Thea ate a granola bar she found in her coat pocket, and Fletcher filled a second fuel tank mounted in the truck bed that she hadn't noticed before. The kind of fuel tank you brought when you didn't trust there would be more fuel. She filed this information away without comment. By the time the highway surrendered entirely to gravel, the light had turned the heavy copper color of late afternoon in October. The trees had changed too, the spruce giving way to old-growth boreal, the trunks thicker and darker, the undergrowth stripped down to bare rock and frost-burned moss. The road was barely a road. It was more of a strong suggestion of direction pressed into the earth by the repeated passage of heavy tires. The truck lurched and pitched over exposed roots. The suspension groaned at every dip. Thea braced her good hand against the door panel and stared straight ahead. She would not ask him to slow down. She would not show him her teeth chattering or the white of her knuckles. The temperature dropped sharply after the sun fell behind the tree line. Thea's coat, a wool blend she had bought second-hand, was not built for whatever this was. She could feel the cold pressing through it like a hand pressing through wet paper. She tucked her chin into the collar and breathed deliberately, trying to keep the warmth she had. Fletcher reached behind his seat without looking and dropped a heavy canvas blanket into her lap. It smelled of motor oil and cedar. It was the warmest thing she had ever touched in her life. She pulled it up to her collarbone and said nothing. They hit a creek crossing around 9 o'clock at night. Not a bridge, just a shallow ford, the stones slick under the headlights. Truck made it across, but the far bank was soft and the rear wheels lost traction, spinning out in the mud before catching on gravel and lurching forward. Thea's seatbelt locked hard across her chest. She bit her tongue blood, sharp and metallic. She said nothing. She didn't sleep, though her body wanted to pull her under. She watched the tree line slide past in the headlights and kept herself awake by cataloging things she could control. Her breathing, the position of her hands, the angle of her spine. Her mother had taught her that trick in the hospital waiting rooms. Count what you have, not what you don't. She had one duffel bag. She had a husband she didn't know. She had nowhere else to go. That was the full inventory. They stopped moving just after midnight. Fletcher killed the engine. In the sudden silence, Thea heard nothing. No highway noise, no wind in wires, no distant hum of any human infrastructure. Just the creak of cooling metal and the sound of her own breathing. She looked out the window. The headlights had died with the engine, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. When they did, she saw the outline of a structure against the sky. Low and dark, a peaked roof, timber walls. Not large. "This is it?" she asked. "For the night," Fletcher said. He got out and she followed, her legs stiff and unreliable after 11 hours in the cab. The cold hit her like a wall. Not the polite October cold of Rivière du Loup. This was a different order of thing entirely, a cold with mass and intention. The kind that pressed in from all sides and found the gaps in seams and collars and the spaces between fingers. The cabin was a single room with a cast-iron stove, a wooden table, 2 shelves of supplies, and a narrow bunk. It smelled of old smoke and pine pitch. Fletcher built a fire in the stove with the efficiency of a man who had done it in the dark many times. Within 20 minutes, the room had shifted from brutally cold to merely uncomfortable. He boiled water. He made instant oatmeal, 2 bowls, and set one in front of her without comment. She ate it so fast she burned the roof of her mouth. In the morning she learned there were still 4 more hours to go. The final stretch was not a road. It was a trail in the technical sense. 2 ruts pressed into the earth by something heavier than this truck, overgrown at the edges with alder brush that scraped the paint as they pushed through. The trees were enormous here, the sky visible only in a narrow strip above the trail. It felt like passing through the ribcage of something ancient. They forded 2 more creeks. At the second one, the water reached the running boards. Thea lifted her feet automatically, which did nothing useful, but she did it anyway. Fletcher didn't smile. He didn't not smile either. His face was simply focused on the problem in front of him. An hour past the second creek, he stopped the truck. "Look," he said. It was the first word he had spoken in 90 minutes. Thea looked. Ahead, through a gap in the trees, she could see light. Not sunlight through leaves, but actual constructed light, the warm amber squares of windows. As the trail curved and the trees fell back, the structure resolved out of the forest. A timber frame house, 2 stories, a wide covered porch running the full length of the front face, stone chimney trailing a thread of smoke into the pale morning sky. Behind it, a series of outbuildings, a workshop, what looked like a greenhouse structure, a barn. All of it tucked into a broad natural clearing where a small river bent against a granite escarpment and caught the morning light. It was not a cabin. Thea stared. She thought of the single room with the narrow bunk where they had spent the night. She thought of the truck that needed a second fuel tank. She thought of the food she had been imagining for 11 hours, something hot and real, and suddenly understood that it had probably been here, waiting, the entire time. Fletcher pulled the truck up to the porch and turned off the engine. Thea did not move immediately. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the house. Then she looked at the man beside her, his canvas jacket creased and worn, his hands rough as quarried stone on the steering wheel. "This is yours," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. The single syllable landed like a stone dropped into a well. She got out of the truck. She stood in the clearing and turned slowly, taking in the full perimeter of it. The tree line, the river, the granite wall at the back of the clearing. The house was substantial, well built, old enough to have settled into itself, new enough that the roof was sound and the windows fitted tight. She walked up the porch steps. She stopped at the door and turned back. Fletcher was unloading the truck with the same methodical quiet. He did everything. "How long?" she asked. He looked up. "What? How long have you had this?" He lifted her duffel bag from the truck bed. "Long time." The anger moved through her slowly like ice thawing, first in pieces, then in a sheet. She had sat in that truck for 15 hours. She had eaten a granola bar and a bowl of instant oatmeal. She had crossed 4 creek beds in the dark. She had bled and bitten her tongue and clenched her jaw until it ached, all in the belief that this was what awaited her. A hard, spare life in the backcountry, a trade, survival for survival. She had been building her tolerance for deprivation the entire journey, and the entire time he had known about this. He climbed the porch steps with her bag. She didn't move aside. "You let me think we were going to live in a shack," she said. "I didn't say that. You didn't say anything." "No," he agreed. He met her eyes for the first time since the courthouse. His were gray, pale and steady, the color of lake ice in March. "I didn't." He stepped around her and opened the door. She almost didn't follow him. What stopped her was not the cold, though the cold was significant. What stopped her was the sound of her own internal voice, the one that had gotten her through the hospital waiting rooms, and the landlord's calls, and the weeks of reduced hours at the diner, reminding her that standing on a porch in the wilderness in October accomplished nothing. She could be angry inside. She could be furious in the warmth. She followed him in. The interior was not what she expected from the outside, which was already more than she had expected. The main room had high ceilings and wide plank floors worn smooth by years of use. A stone fireplace occupied the entire east wall. The kitchen was at the back, fitted with a cast iron range and open shelving stocked with supplies. Real supplies, not the emergency kind. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A window above the sink that looked out over the river. It was a home. Someone had built it to be lived in. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the shelves. "Whose was it?" she asked. Fletcher set her bag down by the stairs. He didn't answer immediately. He crossed to the range and began building a fire in the firebox with the same practiced motion as the night before. "My father's," he said finally. "And his father's." "And you?" She turned to look at him. "Why do you drive 11 hours to trade work in Rivière-du-Loup if you have?" She gestured at the room. "This." Fletcher put the last of the kindling in and closed the grate. He stood with his back to her for a moment before turning. 3 years ago I brought a woman up here," he said. His voice was flat and uninflected, the way voices get when they've said a thing so many times inside their own head that it's lost its feeling. "Her name was Clara. I'd met her in Montreal, brought her up in the summer when the road was good and the river was down and it all looks different. She liked it." He paused. "She liked it until November. By January she'd packed what she could carry and left with the man who ran the supply depot at Sainte Marguerite." Thea didn't speak. "She said I'd misrepresented the life." He said the words without bitterness, which was somehow worse, that I should have been honest about what winters were like, that anyone would have left given the reality of it. "And so this time," Thea said, her voice very careful, "you made sure I understood the reality." Fletcher looked at her. "I wanted to see who you were before you were here. It's easy to stay somewhere beautiful." The clarity of it made her jaw tighten. She understood the logic. She could even see the scarred arithmetic underneath it, the way one sufficient betrayal could rearrange a person's entire approach to risk. She had done her own version of it after her mother's first hospitalization. She had stopped believing doctors who spoke with too much confidence. She had learned to trust the ones who said "I don't know yet" and kept their hands visible on the table. That didn't mean she had to accept it quietly. "You tested me," she said. "Like I was an animal you weren't sure would survive transport." "Yes. And if I had asked you to stop the truck and let me out somewhere?" For the first time something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly. Something more like honesty working its way to the surface. "I would have driven you back to Rivière-du-Loup. I wouldn't have let you walk." He paused. "But I wouldn't have brought you here." Thea stood with that. She thought about Clara, who had come in summer and left in January. She thought about what it would mean to leave before you understood what the place actually asked of you. She thought about her mother in the hospital, who had told her once, "The only people I trust are the ones who've already seen the worst of something and stayed anyway." She was furious. She wanted to be clear about that, even standing here in her own head. She was also, underneath the fury, something she didn't quite have a word for yet. She turned away from him and began opening cupboard doors. Where do you keep the coffee? She asked. There was a pause. Left of the range, second shelf. She found it. She found the kettle. She filled it from the hand pump over the sink, which sputtered cold and clear, and she put it on the range, which was beginning to push warmth into the room. She did not make him a cup of. She made herself one, and she stood at the kitchen window, with both hands wrapped around the mug, and looked at the river running over the stones in the clear October light. He didn't say anything. He went out to deal with the truck. The first 2 weeks had the quality of a very cold negotiation. Thea learned the rhythms of the place the way she had once learned the rhythms of the diner, not because someone told her, but because she watched and catalogued and made decisions accordingly. Fletcher rose before light and came back after dark. He was working on something in the workshop, though she didn't ask what. He chopped wood every second evening with the kind of sustained, methodical effort that Thea recognized as the physical equivalent of thinking hard about something. She took the house, not as a concession and not as an assignment. She took it because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the house had not been properly lived in for some time. There were signs of Clara's absence in small details: a dried herb bundle left too long, a shelf organized by someone who didn't cook. Thea reorganized. She found the root cellar under the kitchen floorboards and spent an afternoon inventorying it. She fixed a draft in the east bedroom window, using caulking she found in the workshop supply shelf. She didn't ask permission, he didn't comment. On the 12th day it began to snow. Not the thin, tentative snow of early season, but the real thing. Heavy, purposeful, the kind that comes in and stays. By morning it had covered the porch rail, and the truck was a white shape in the clearing. Thea stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it fall. Fletcher came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped when he saw her standing there. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "No," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. That night he built a fire in the main room hearth and opened a bottle of dark whiskey from a cabinet she hadn't noticed below the bookshelf. He poured 2 glasses without asking and set one on the table beside her chair. She looked at it. "Clara didn't like the cold," he said from across the fireplace. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It sounded more like a fact he was setting down between them so they could both look at it. "I know," Thea said. "You told me. I'm not sorry for how I did this," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm sorry about the granola bar." She glanced at him. His expression was entirely serious. There was no smirk underneath the words, no performed guilt, just a man who had decided that one specific detail deserved acknowledgement. The laugh surprised her. It came out before she could make a decision about it, a short, involuntary sound, not quite humor, but something adjacent to it. Fletcher watched her with the careful attention of a man who is not used to being surprised by anything, and finds that he prefers it. The granola bar was not adequate, she agreed. Nor the oatmeal. The oatmeal was necessary. So was the granola bar, technically, by that definition. He was quiet for a moment, then, fair. Thea picked up the whiskey glass. She turned it in her hands, the firelight catching in the amber liquid. She thought about Rivière du Loup, the landlord's phone calls, the hospital bills in their serious fonts. She thought about her mother telling her to count what she had. She had a house built to be lived in. She had a river out the kitchen window. She had, apparently, a husband who apologized for granola bars with complete sincerity, and not at all for the rest of it. "I'm not going to leave in the spring," she said. It wasn't a declaration, it was information. Fletcher looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said, "but I need better coffee. Whatever you've been buying is terrible." He considered this gravely. "I'll add it to the St. Marguerite order. And I want to know what you're building in the workshop." A pause. "A sled. For the river in winter, to check the trap line. Is there a second one?" He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, not quite warmth, but whatever exists in the territory between them. "Not yet." "Then add that to the list too," Thea said. She settled back into the chair with her whiskey and looked at the fire. "I'm not staying inside all winter." Outside, the snow came down in the dark, heavy and indifferent, burying the clearing and the truck and the trail back to the road. It didn't matter. The fire burned hot, The coffee was bad but warm, and Thea Garnier, who had once run out of options, found that she had somehow run into something else entirely. She didn't have a word for it yet. She thought she might have time to find one.